Frank Abagnale. For nearly 5 years during the 1960s, this young American man successfully impersonated an airline pilot, a doctor, and a lawyer, all before the age of 21. He cashed millions of dollars in fraudulent checks across 26 countries, moving from city to city before authorities could catch up. What made him so difficult to catch was not just his confidence, but his ability to study a role thoroughly and blend in completely. He would walk into a library, read everything available about a profession, and then present himself as a credible expert within days. Airlines, hospitals, and law firms all accepted him without question. He was eventually caught in France in 1969, but not before living a life that most trained investigators found almost impossible to believe. His story became one of the most studied cases in the history of fraud, later inspiring books, films, and even FBI training programs focused on identity deception. D.B Cooper. In November 1971, a man using the name Dan Cooper hijacked a Northwest Orient flight, collected $200,000 in ransom, and then parachuted out of the plane somewhere over the Pacific Northwest, never to be found. The FBI launched one of the longest investigations in its history, interviewing hundreds of suspects over several decades, but no confirmed trace of Cooper was ever discovered. A small bundle of the ransom money turned up along a riverbank in 1980, but it only deepened the mystery rather than solving it. Investigators could never determine whether he survived the jump, since the weather that night was poor and the terrain below was dense forest. What made the case so enduring was not just the theft, but the complete disappearance of a man who seemed to vanish into thin air in the middle of a controlled situation. To this day, D.B. Cooper remains the only unsolved case of air piracy in American commercial aviation history, and the FBI officially suspended active investigation in 2016. Whitey Bulger, for 16 years, this Boston crime boss lived as a fugitive while on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, second only to Osama bin Laden at one point. What made his disappearance so remarkable was that he had spent years as an FBI informant, giving him unusually deep knowledge of how federal investigations were structured and conducted. He understood surveillance techniques, witness protection procedures, and the way tip lines worked, and he used all of that knowledge to stay one step ahead. He relocated to Santa Monica, California, and lived quietly under a false identity alongside his longtime girlfriend, keeping a low profile in a beachside apartment for over a decade. Neighbors described him as a friendly older man. He was finally caught in 2011, not through sophisticated detective work, but after a public awareness campaign specifically targeted his girlfriend through television advertisements in Iceland, where she had connections. He had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. Viktor Lustig. This Czechoslovakian-born con artist pulled off one of the most audacious scams in history when he sold the Eiffel Tower, not once, but twice, to scrap metal dealers in Paris during the 1920s. He posed as a senior government official, fabricated convincing documents on official-looking stationery, and invited a small group of dealers to a private meeting where he explained that the tower had become too expensive to maintain and was to be demolished quietly. He chose his targets carefully, selecting men wealthy enough to afford the deal, but also eager enough to keep it secret, since the transaction was framed as confidential. The first victim was too embarrassed to report the fraud, which gave Lustig enough time to identify a second buyer and attempt the same scheme again before leaving the country. He later moved to the United States and shifted his focus to counterfeiting currency, producing fake bills so precise that the Secret Service openly acknowledged they were among the most difficult forgeries they had ever encountered. The Antwerp diamond heist crew. Over a weekend in February 2003, a group of thieves broke into what was considered one of the most secure vaults in the world, located in the Antwerp Diamond Center in Belgium, and walked away with an estimated $100 million in diamonds, gold, and jewelry. The planning behind the operation was meticulous. They had rented an office in the building months earlier, specifically to observe daily security patterns and staff routines without raising suspicion. On the night of the heist, they used a handmade device to block the vault's motion sensor signal, bypassed a magnetic lock, and worked through the weekend undisturbed because the building was empty. When staff arrived on Monday morning, they found over 100 of the vault's boxes broken open and emptied. Investigators eventually arrested a handful of suspects, but recovered only a small portion of the stolen goods. Most of the diamonds were never found. Several key members of the crew were never identified. Ronald Biggs. One of the participants in Britain's Great Train Robbery of 1963, Biggs was part of a gang that stopped a Royal Mail train in the English countryside and stole the equivalent of over $40 million in today's money from postal workers who were transporting used banknotes. He was caught relatively quickly, tried, and sentenced to 25 years in prison. But within 15 months of starting his sentence, he escaped from Wandsworth Prison in London by scaling the wall with a rope ladder and dropping into a waiting vehicle outside. What followed was one of the most drawn-out fugitive stories in British criminal history. He lived under assumed identities in Australia for a period, then moved to Brazil after his cover was blown by a journalist. Once in Brazil, he fathered a child with a local woman, which under Brazilian law at the time made him immune to extradition requests from the British government. He lived openly in Rio de Janeiro for years, giving press interviews, appearing in a punk rock recording, and becoming something of a folk figure in both countries. British police could see him clearly, knew exactly where he was, and were completely unable to touch him. He voluntarily returned to the United Kingdom in 2001, citing deteriorating health after 36 years as a fugitive, and died in a care home in 2013. Christophe Rocancourt. This French con artist spent much of the 1990s living among the wealthy elite of Los Angeles and the Hamptons, convincing socialites, investors, and celebrities that he was a member of the Rockefeller family with access to vast inherited wealth. He had no such connections. He fabricated his entire identity, complete with a false backstory, a convincing wardrobe, and the kind of effortless social ease that money tends to produce in people who have always had it. He borrowed heavily from his new acquaintances under the promise of returns that never came, living extravagantly on their money while moving between luxury hotels and private social circles. Estimates suggest he defrauded people of somewhere between $1 and $40 million over the course of his scheme. He was eventually arrested in Canada in 2000 after years of evading American authorities by crossing borders frequently. What made his case particularly striking was not the money, but the willingness of intelligent, successful people to accept him completely based on nothing more than confident presentation and a persuasive story.